have 3 petition campaigns going. One is to lift the United States blockade on Cuba. 2 is to free the Cuban Five. And 3 is to extradite anti-Cuba terrorist Luis Posada Carriles to Venezuela to do his service time for his terrorist acts. We present Cuba to youth, students, women, marginalized communities, and all working and oppressed people here in Canada as an example of a better way of doing things and as an inspiration. Which brings me to the 26th of July movement. The July 26, 1953 attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba was not merely about the participants wanting to rid Cuba of the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista and his U.S. masters and their influence. The attack was symbolic of the overall feeling of enough is enough, of Cubans' desire for change. In 1953, Fidel Castro and his fellow fighters did not just establish the 26th of July movement, did not just start the Cuban Revolution. They started what is now known as the Battle of Ideas. So now we invite you to sit back, enjoy the food, videos, and our speakers for the evening, and experience the real Cuba, the revolutionary spirit, music and dancing, and overall good spirits.
Pasaron 2-3 días, junto a Becas y Bebeca. Pasaron 2-3 días, junto a Becas y Bebeca.
I want you to reflect for a moment. Imagine that you have a son or brother or a husband who has told you that they wanted to do something. They told you that they wanted to make a difference and save lives. They told you that they were going into the belly of the beast to find out how and why a terrorist group was hell-bent on terrorizing your way of life and your family. Now imagine after some time you receive word that your son, brother, or husband were arrested for monitoring this terrorist group by the U.S. government, the same government who publicly denounced any acts of terrorism in the world. That U.S. government decided that it was in its best interest to unlawfully detain your loved one in solitary confinement for 17 months and then hand down a life sentence to them based on false charges. This government felt it was further necessary to continually deny visiting visas for you to see your loved one, because you could be a possible terrorist or a danger to the United States. Since September 12, 1998, the wives and families of 5 brave souls, Fernando Gonzalez, Rene Gonzalez, Antonio Guerrero, Gerardo Hernandez, and Ramon Labanino, have been living this reality. Since the 2001 conviction of the 5, their loved ones have been faced with one question. In the face of such an injustice, what do? You speak out. You reach out to anyone who would listen, because you know that for this to end, people need to really understand what's going on. They need to know that the U.S. government's true colors, blood red. Blood red because they have made no secret of the fact that their FBI and CIA agents actively support the violent actions of organizations whose sole purpose is to terrorize and kill Cubans who don't want to be controlled by the U.S. government. The nature of the charges made against the 5 fly in the face of what is right and legal in the United States and international judicial system. Just to give you an idea of the injustice, let me tell you about one of the charges against these 5. One of the charge is on crimes of espionage. With this charge, the prosecutors and the highest ranking U.S. military official on intelligence from the Pentagon could not find any evidence nor recall any presence of national defense secrets in the 20,000 pages of correspondence between the Five and Cuba. Instead, they had to base their argument on the fact that Antonio Guerrero worked on a naval training base in southern Florida. Despite the fact that Antonio never applied for security clearance, worked on a base that was completely open to the public for viewing and photographs, and that FBI agents who had been surveying him for 2 years before the arrest could not testify to any wrongdoing by Antonio, the charges stood. Why? Because they were tried in Miami, in the very hotbed of anti-Cuban terror organization. The trial took place in an atmosphere where 650,000 Cuban exiles were hostile to the Cuban government and gave the margin of victory to George W. Bush in the 2000 presidential election. This irrational injustice must speak to each one of us on a personal level. Ask yourself, what would I do if this happened to the people who I love? You would do exactly what the families are doing now. They are traveling tirelessly around the world to speak to those who would listen. They use the only weapon they have, the truth. It is our job to make sure that their efforts are amplified, that they know that they are not alone in this fight. On August 20th, the next round of appeal hearings for the Five will be held in Atlanta. Now, more than ever, the rest of the world must know what's really happening and why the Five must be freed. We need to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters who suffer needlessly and just want their loved ones to come home. Why? Because we know that these Five could be any of us. The U.S. government must know that we will not tolerate such indecency and such gross violations to basic human rights. The case of the Five is not only of 5 heroes that defend the gains that the July 26 movement brought as they fight against the same tyranny of U.S. imperialism that the July 26 fighters fought. They are also an example of Cuba's ongoing struggle for a better world and are today what the July 26 fighters were in 1953.
Ideas cannot be killed, Sarria emphatically said. Fidel Castro Ruz, in one of his many recent reflections, repeated these words which ring as true today as they did 54 years ago. He went on to explain, Sarria was a black lieutenant, a patrol leader in Batista's army who arrested us. And after the attempt to seize the Moncada garrison, while 3 of us slept in a small mountain hut, exhausted by the effort of breaking through the siege, the soldiers, fueled by hatred and adrenaline, were aiming their weapons at me even before they had identified who I was. Ideas cannot be killed. The black lieutenant kept on repeating, practically automatically, in a hushed voice. But let's step back a few days to the events preceding these fateful words. On July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro and 150 other young revolutionaries attempted to take Cuba back from the hands of U.S. imperialism, from the cruel dictator Batista, from poverty, repression, and humiliation. These young and brave revolutionaries, inexperienced but determined, saw Cuba corrupted from the pocketbooks of rich Americans who owned Cuba's land and resources with their foreign companies, their big houses, their hotels, as at the same time over 90% of Cubans were illiterate, with many of them an estimated over 30% out of work and unemployment during most of the year, and living in poverty and repressed by the US-backed dictator Batista. These 150 people, who were students, workers, artists, teachers, and other regular people, were a product of the frustration of all Cubans, with a history of fighting two intense wars of independence, and this independence then being hijacked by US imperialism, had reached a point where they would take no more of this humiliation. The thoughts and motives of all Cubans were in the fighters of July 26th, whose attack was staged on the Moncada Army garrison in Santiago de Cuba with the goal of overtaking the weapons cache and handing over the tools of the oppressor to the oppressed, to arm the people for the coming fight for their liberation. In Cuba right now, people are celebrating this day as one of the most important in their country's history. But July 26th attack on Moncada was a failure. Despite all the preparation, unexpected accidents of timing, directions, and calculations alerted Batista's army, and the 26th July fighters, though fighting valiantly, were captured. Some killed in the attack, but most killed after torture in prison. So why is this celebrated? Batista's army may have won with force, but Fidel and the July 26th fighters won with ideas. Batista, ignorant of the power of ideas and the people's will to fight for justice, could not conceive of the idea that a small group of ill-prepared, inexperienced civilians could come close to undermining his rule, and was convinced that a foreign government had funded and prepared them. Of course, we all know this isn't true. And even with the kangaroo court trial that followed for some, including Fidel, these ideas could not be killed. After Fidel's legal defense, concluding with the powerful words, "Sentence me, it doesn't matter. History will absolve me," Batista's courts tried to get away with sentencing Fidel for 15 years in prison. But these ideas were too powerful to be kept in prison walls. As the underground movement spread, Fidel's defense speech throughout the country, garnering support and weakening Batista's position, to the point where he had to release Fidel and other fighters after only 2 years. Their release did not release this building pressure, however, as the Cubans' desire for a better life and a better world grew. This process sped up as Fidel and others regrouped in Mexico to form the July 26th Revolutionary Movement, which in 1956 returned to Cuba to begin the Cuban Revolution that in 1959 triumphed with the might and ideas of the people of Cuba. Ideas cannot be killed. Fast forward to right now. Cuba's ongoing revolutionary process was not killed when the U.S. began its blockade that keeps medicines, machinery, and resources out of Cuba. It was not killed during the special period during the collapse of the Soviet Union that we watched a bit of in the film Desafío, when Cuba lost most of its trade overnight. Despite the U.S. government's hopes, clearly outlined in their Commission for the Assistance to a Free Cuba, that the revolution will end one day when Fidel dies, this is proved untrue by the manifestation of these words repeated through the ages, throughout the victories of the Cuban Revolution, of the Battle of Ideas, in which Cuba proves that a better world is possible, because ideas cannot be killed. Cuba keeps these ideas alive as they live with the gains of the Cuban Revolution. These show that the world is possible for the whole population to be guaranteed free health care. with the most doctors per capita of any country in the world, and with the lowest infant mortality rate in Latin America. These show the world that education can be free and accessible, as Cubans can go to university to the highest PhD level without paying anything. And children can learn computer skills from age 6 and English from grade 3. And Cuba shows this to the world, not only in their own country, but by sending doctors around the world to help millions of people. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, Cuba offered to send doctors to New Orleans, and they were turned down, they were ignored. And instead, a little while later, the big massive hurricane in Pakistan happened, and instead Cuba sent doctors to Pakistan, up into the hillsides where other countries would not send their doctors, with women doctors who were very appreciated in some smaller villages, and they worked hard, and they are remembered and respected around the world. They also show this through their Yo Si Puedo, Yes, I Can Do It, literacy programs that have been used from Venezuela all the way to Australia. So that is why we are celebrating July 26th tonight. We are celebrating it because July 26th was the beginning of the end of U.S. domination. It was the beginning of a movement that doesn't just stop at the gains I just outlined, but pushes onward and forward. As people in Cuba celebrate it, we must also celebrate it from the inspiration and the hope that the July 26th fighters of 1953 and of today give the world in their struggle for a better world. Viva Cuba! Viva! Viva la Revolución! Viva! Viva Fidel! Viva! Thank you very much.